Hello, and welcome to the virtual Scandinavia House and today's book talk, The Border, featuring the author Erika Fatland, and will be moderated by Jessica Case. The book is out now on Pegasus Books, and a big thank you to our friends over at Pegasus for making all of this possible. This talk is being recorded and will be made available on our website, scandinavias.org, as well as our YouTube page. Feel free to ask questions in the chat section, and we'll get to them towards the end of the program. I'll also put a link to where one can purchase a book in that chat function. Erika Fatland studied social anthropology at the University of Oslo and is the author of 2 previous books in Norwegian as well as Sovietland. She speaks 8 languages and lives in Oslo. And moderating today is Jessica Case, the Deputy Publisher and Director of Publicity at Pegasus Books. Jessica graduated from Princeton University with a degree in history and a minor in Russian. Since moving to Pegasus in 2007, she has focused on acquiring a wide array of books, including literary fiction, upmarket crime and suspense fiction, and serious nonfiction, history, biographies, popular science, music, and narrative nonfiction. So please do welcome Erika and Jessica.
Hello, everyone, and thanks so much for hosting us, Kyle. I'm just thrilled to be having this dialogue with Erika today. This is actually the second book Pegasus has published with Erika. Her first, Sovietland, took us through Central Asia, where we explored Turkmenistan, Kazakhstan, Tajikistan, Kyrgyzstan, and Uzbekistan, regions that were relatively new to modern statehood, but rich in ancient culture, history, and landscapes. And that region from her first book has lived under the shadow of the former Soviet Union and Russia. And that spurred the subject of Erika's second book, The Border, which we're going to discuss here today. Here it is. So I think that might prompt my first question for you, Erika. Why Russia? It's been at the core of these 2 books, and there certainly isn't a border that's any longer. And I think maybe even before you start, I'll reiterate just for the audience, the places you traveled. North Korea, China, Mongolia, Kazakhstan, Azerbaijan, Georgia, Ukraine, Belarus, Lithuania, Poland, Latvia, Estonia, Finland, Norway, and then also the Northeast Passage. So tell us about it and just how long did it take?
In 259 days in total. I did it in 2 long trips and then 2 shorter trips for the Northeast Passage and then the Norwegian Russian border that I followed in a kayak and by foot. So I've been fascinated by Russia for as long as I can remember. And I remember at school, it was in the 1990s, but we still had the old maps showing the Soviet Union. And just looking at the size, I found it so extremely fascinating. In the Soviet Union, the biggest country in the world, Russia is still the biggest country in the world. And going from what's the title of the sea in English? Well, almost from Sweden, from Norway, and then to the Pacific. And then when I was finishing Sovietland, and I was looking for good ideas because I don't have a job. So I need to have good ideas. And I had many ideas and none of them were particularly good. And then one night I had a dream. I remember it very well. It was in February 2014. And in that dream, I was walking on a large map and I was walking from country to country. But north of the red line, the same country was always there. It was Russia. So then when I woke up, I had a plan ready for the next years. I decided to do that journey in reality, to travel around the largest country in the world to kind of research what does it mean to have Russia as your neighbor. So Norway, my country, is one of those 14 neighbors, but there are 13 other countries.
Yeah. So, I mean, logistically, that must have been very complicated, especially for places like North Korea, right? Not the most open society. So what were some of the challenges you might have faced just to even undertake the journey itself, not, writing aside, just to even actually do the navigation?
Okay, so the first thing I did after waking up from this dream, because in all modesty, I found the idea very good. So my first worry was that this idea is so good that certainly someone else has already written that book. So the first thing I did was to go to Amazon and search for any books that might resemble this book. And to my great surprise and joy, I discovered that, no one had written this book. And so I decided, okay, I will do it, and I need to hurry before someone else does it. But then as I was traveling around the border and somewhere in Mongolia, I believe, it dawned upon me why no one had bothered to write this book, because it really was a long journey and quite uncomfortable at times in visiting places in China where no foreigners go, radioactive places in Kazakhstan and Ukraine, and North Korea, as you mentioned. Well, visiting North Korea is not really difficult unless you are American or a writer, a journalist, because the embassy, North Korean embassies, they demand that you have some kind of proof from your employer where you're working. And then, of course, I could not show any paper from my publishing house, and I don't, as I mentioned, I don't have a job. So then I needed to be creative to get the visa, and I just signed up to go in a normal tour group. And then my family on the father's side, they run the largest private slaughterhouse in Norway. And myself, I'm a vegetarian, but finally this background came in handy. So I went to North Korea with a paper saying I was the receptionist at the slaughterhouse.
Yeah, there you go. I know sometimes weird family connections can come in handy. So I guess, speaking of family, you're from Oslo in Norway, and that's a country I think we don't automatically think of as being a neighbor of Russia, unlike, say, Finland, right, which is a very kind of long and protracted relationship with Russia. So maybe tell us a bit about how Norway and Finland's experience differed, and then if you could also touch on that very cool Karen point where all three countries actually intersect, which I think is kind of neat.
Yes, so Norway's border with Russia is like North Korea's border with Russia. It's quite short. North Korean border is around 19 kilometers, and the Norwegian-Russian border is 196 kilometers. And of all the 14 neighboring countries of Russia, Norway is the only country that has never been at war with Russia or been occupied by Russia. So that says something about what it's like being the neighbor of Russia. I mean, countries like France and Great Britain, they took colonies on other countries, while Russia just kept expanding, occupying the neighbors. And then as I started writing the book, I did ask myself, so why not Norway? Why are we the exception? Look at Finland, they have a total different history, and they were part of the of the Russian Empire for a long time. And then I realized that the reason is quite logical, and it has to do with geography. So the border between Norway and Russia is way up in the north. So it's very far from Oslo. It's 2,000 kilometers away from Oslo. And before Murmansk was founded in 1916 during the First World War, and they also built the railway at the same time up there. Then before Murmansk was founded, the fastest way to go from St. Petersburg to the Norwegian-Russian border, that was with a boat around the whole Scandinavian peninsula. So it was just not practical, just too inconvenient to occupy Norway.
Yeah, lucky. And I think, so Russia had invaded North Korea as well. That might be news to some people. So how long, what was the circumstances of that kind of invasion? I think we always think of them as kind of being more threatened by China and kind of other countries.
Yes, North Korea is a very interesting example, because as you say, today, China is definitely the most important neighbor, and also the border with China is much, much longer than the border with Russia. But the story with Soviet Union and North Korea goes back to 1945, the end of the Second World War. And so even if the border is very, very short, and the contact between Russia and North Korea, I mean, there's not much contact today, no country has influenced North Korea as much as the Soviet Union. And that is simply because in 1945, the Korean peninsula was divided between the two countries that one the Second World War. So US got control of South Korea, and then Soviet Union of North Korea. And after having chased out the Japanese from Pyongyang, the Soviet government, they needed a puppet to control North Korea, like for the Soviet Union. And then they found a 33-year-old man whom they thought would be perfect because he had spent most of his life in China in exile, like many North Koreans. So he had not really any contacts with the more nationalist communists living in North Korea. And secondly, he had spent the Second World War in a Soviet military camp in Siberia, so he spoke Russian. He did not speak Korean very well, so before he was giving his first speech in the fall of 1945, he needed to get intensive training in Korean by Soviet intelligence officers. And that man was Kim Il-sung. And Kim Il-sung turned out not to be a puppet at all. He was very good at playing China and Soviet Union against each other. And he survived 6 Soviet general secretaries. He survived the Soviet Union itself, and he didn't die until 1994. And then by that time, he had created a hereditary dictatorship. And today it's his grandson ruling this country like a big prison.
Yeah. Wow. Yeah, that's amazing. Yeah, no, and I think, even as we have kind of turned towards, the Ukraine and, the Russia war there, but, North Korea is still doing all its tests and making sure that we have not forgotten them. So, so I think overall what struck me when I was, doing my first initial read of The Border was that the whole theme of the book, it's about relationships, right? Between states, obviously between these sovereign states and Russia, political systems, neighbors, ethnic groups, different faiths, how they all get along or don't. So besides the fact that every country but Norway has been occupied or invaded by Russia, was there a commonality you found in different places and people with their relationships to Russia? Or were there, marked differences that you noticed as you kind of moved through your journey?
Okay, so if we just put North Korea, China, and Norway apart. So after entering Kazakhstan, all the countries I traveled through that were former Russian territory. Most of those countries, except Finland, had been part of the Soviet Union, and all of them had been part of the Russian Empire. So from entering Kazakhstan and until arriving in Tallinn in Estonia, I mostly communicated in Russian because most people I met would speak Russian, which is still the lingua franca in many of the post-Soviet countries. So I think it's important to understand when we talk about the current situation with Ukraine, that what happened in 1991, it was not just the fall of the Soviet Union, it was the fall of the Russian Empire. And that is kind of the aftermath that we are seeing today.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. And then I guess, kind of a flip side of the coin of, relationships would be identity. I think a lot of the people that you meet, they're trying to carve out identities for themselves, and, identity and borders can sometimes be a little bit arbitrary or kind of put upon you by someone else. Especially with Russia as a neighbor, people were trying to carve out their own identities, with such a force just over the border. One of the stories that stuck out to me was the story of Aragalan in Mongolia, who's ethnically Tuvan, and how he tries to define himself. Maybe we can talk a little about him.
Mm-hmm. So this was a beautiful part of the journey in Mongolia, and I went to a very, very remote part of Mongolia, and I would say that all of Mongolia is really quite remote. There are not many roads there, so mainly you travel off-road, and then to go to this northern part close to the border with Russia, I first driving by car, and then we had to ride on horses, and then finally when we found these Tuvan people, and they call themselves the Satan people in Mongolian, and that just means the reindeer people. people because they are reindeer herders, like they are also on the Tuvan side in Siberia. And so then the very last part of the journey, I was riding on a reindeer, which was quite exotic. And I felt so cool sitting on that reindeer until I saw the photograph of me sitting on the reindeer, and I just looked enormous. And the reindeer is very small. They are very small animals. But yes, and I met these solitary reindeer herders. There were not many left. And traditionally, they're all from Tuva, from Siberia. But then in the 50s, during Stalin, some of them escaped the repressive regime of Stalin and crossed the Mongolian border and decided to live there. And I asked, it was Agalan, right? I mean, you remember the name better than I do. I asked him about if he felt Tuvan or Russian or Mongolian. And he would say, well, I'm Mongolian, I live in Mongolia. The only thing that makes me apart is that I don't live in the same tents like the Mongolian. I have reindeers and I speak Tuvan language, but other than that, I'm 100% Mongolian.
Yeah, no, I think that's, I just thought that was such a beautiful story. And I didn't realize reindeer were so tiny. I always think of them as bigger than horses. I guess that's not true. So I think, speaking of Mongolia, one of the things I was surprised to learn that it's actually one of the more successful democracies of the post-Soviet states, which I found especially interesting since it is kind of sandwiched between Russia and China, right? It's a bit of a tough spot. But perhaps, of course, it's, geography and traditions, maybe are a bit of an asset there. So much of its life seems to be still so deeply rooted in its nomadic history. You were sharing some of the statistics about the yurts that, occupy, kind of border the capital city, the terrifying dzoods, those winters. So maybe tell us a bit more about kind of the life and culture of Mongolia when you visited. And of course, there's Genghis Khan.
Of course. So Mongolia is one of the countries where you can still find full-time nomads, full-year nomads. So traditionally, all Mongolians were nomads and then traveling around with their yurt, their round tent, and their animals, which would be sheep, camels, horses, etc. So you can imagine they are very free, stubborn, strong people, but they live in a very difficult climate. And you mentioned the Dzud. So Dzud is a name of a very tough winter when most of the herd dies. Can be different reasons, but it's too cold, there's no food. So then Mongolia is a quite well-functioning democracy, but it's not a social democracy. It's not a rich country. So when these nomads lose their herd, they don't get any support from the state, really. Then they are left with nothing. So then what happens is that every year, thousands of nomads have to give up their traditional way of life. And then they move to Ulaanbaatar, the capital of Mongolia, where about half of the population are living. And the population is not big, it's only 3 million in total. And then in Mongolia, traditionally, you don't need to own the land to be able to settle there with your tent. So in the capital, if I remember correctly, about half of the population are then living in yurts. So that is like, what's the English word? It means it's not really a suburb, it's more like a slum, really, where these former nomads are now living in their tents, and they often don't have electricity, no running water. So if you go there in the winter, you will have a hard time breathing because they are heating their yurts, they are not very well isolated, right? It's tents, and they are heating them with coal, with charcoal. So actually, I mean, it's quite surprising and maybe even ironic that Ulaanbaatar, which is the capital of this enormous country with so much nature, and so much wild nature. It's in the winter, it's one of the most polluted capitals in the world.
I know, it sounds like kind of both, otherworldly and terrifying, these, for the audience, these, the zoods, the winters, there's all these different kinds. There's one where there's a lot of snow. So, all the herds die because the snow's too deep. And sometimes it can be too dry. And then there's no water, that's a different kind. And then there's, one's just extreme cold, and then the other one where actually you get a hot spell and then everything melts and then it freezes again. So it's too icy. It's like these kind of, these cycles of just extreme weather that, I couldn't even imagine. And I guess it was kind of unique to Mongolia. So I guess, if we kind of move, across the, west, into the Caucasus, another place that kind of to me loomed very large in the narrative was Georgia. It's kind of a fraught location. It's obviously the birthplace of Stalin. He's one of the big bads of history, and has also, of course, been a target of Putin and Russia's aggression to reassert itself imperially, kind of annexing and really controlling Georgia. So I guess, it brought me to the story of one particular person named Dato Vanishvili, who has kind of found himself trapped by this very arbitrary border that's come down. So maybe we can share his story.
Absolutely. So to me, Dato Vanishvili, he is the symbol of what it means, what it is to be the neighbor of Russia. And so when the Soviet Union broke apart in 1991, that was not really as peaceful as one might think nowadays. And in the Caucasus, the result was 3 countries and 3 breakaway republics. And one of those breakaway republics is South Ossetia. And South Ossetia, since the war with Georgia and Russia in 2008, South Ossetia has been inaccessible from the Georgian side. So South Ossetia was the only place I was not able to go when I was traveling around the border. But I did manage to go very close because there was this man that I really, really wanted to meet, and that was Dato Vanishvili. And he had tragic destiny. So about 10 years ago, he woke up and discovered that the bordering fence of South Ossetia, which is a breakaway republic that is officially doesn't exist. Officially, this territory is Georgian territory, but now it's 100% controlled by Russia. And this border fence, it's not static. It's been moving at night. So the border guards are quietly moving the border fence 10 meters here, 50 meters there. And so one day Dato Vanishvili woke up and he was not living in Georgia anymore. And he had lived in the same Georgian village his whole life. And then one day he was no longer living in Georgia, he was living in South Ossetia, Russian controlled territory. And his wife was very ill. So she could not move from her bed. So she had to stay in her house. They had not the opportunity to leave like many of the neighbors that did. So for 10 years, Dato Vanishvili lived trapped behind this illegal border fence. And I had to do the interview with him with the border fence between us. And also the Russians are guarding this illegal border with cameras. So I was also told that I had 10 minutes. We could not stay longer than 10 minutes and the Russians would come. And I also had to be accompanied by guarded Georgian soldiers to do the interview. And then I was talking with him through that fence. And so Dato Vanishvili, he died last year. He was an old man when he died, 88 years old. But who knows, maybe he could still have been alive because the Russian border guards, they denied him, they did not allow him to cross the border and go to Georgia and get medical help. So he died in March last year.
Oh gosh, yeah, no, I think that, just put such a human face on kind of the whims of these borders and how they affect, could really affect people's lives. another Georgian that we meet in the narrative that I know has really resonated with readers is a woman named Julia. So I think this could be a good opportunity for you to read and share one of her passages in the book.
With pleasure. So this is not a sad story like Dr. Vanishvili's story. So Georgia is really one of my favorite countries. So even if Georgia has this very difficult relationship with Russia, and Russia is occupying 20% of Georgian territory, it still is a very joyful place to travel around. It's a small country, so you can, in a very short time, you can visit all of the country, really. And one of the places I went to was to a monastery very close to the Russian border. So I went there on a day trip from Tbilisi, the capital. And so to go there, I had hired a driver and a guide for the day. And but then as we were approaching that monastery, of course, we could not go directly. We had to eat and drink before going to the monastery. I can easily drink 7 or 8 liters a night, the driver boasted with unashamed pride. All real men in Georgia can. Luckily, he did not drink that day. Julia, the guide, on the other hand, was knocking it back. Every few minutes, she stood up and raised her glass to me, to Georgia, to herself, and to the future. So traditionally, there should be 21 toasts during a celebratory meal, she told me, and always in the same order. It's not a problem if you don't finish the food. You're not supposed to eat it all, but you do have to drink all the alcohol. She'd emptied her glass of chacha, stood up, and recited a long poem in Russian that she had written herself. So I have met many eccentric guides on my travels, but Julia was the most memorable of them all. She was 28, blonde and blue-eyed, and not exactly dressed for hiking, in a body-hugging black top and a leather miniskirt, with a small gray hat perched on her short bob. She was born and raised in Georgia, but both her mother and husband were Russian. I am really a poet, Julia said, and recited another poem with great passion. And again, it was a poem about nature and love, and there were tears in her eyes when she sat down. I'm so unhappy with my husband, she confessed. We got married in August. He's my 3rd husband. Russian, like the last one, and the guide as well. But I don't like him anymore. He's too uncouth. He rides a motorbike and uses bad language. Her previous husband, the father of her 2-year-old son, lived in Russia. My dream is to experience true love, Julia said, and drained another glass of chacha. Even if I have to marry 8 times to find it. But why did you marry the Russian guide if you don't actually like him? I asked. Because I loved him, Julia said, and downed another glass. And then, so miraculously, we did make it to the monastery. And since it was then already quite late, we were the only persons there, and it was a beautiful experience. But then when we left the monastery, it was getting dark, and we had to get back to the village before sunset. And then Julia couldn't find the path. She pretended to be in control, but I could see that she certainly wasn't. But then somehow she did find the path finally. And then she sat down on her miniskirt, riding down the hillside on her miniskirt. And I was running after her on the snow. And then she decided to save some time. We would do a shortcut through 2 meters of snow, which we did. So then when we got back to the place where we had lunch, a family house, we looked terrible, wet, dirty. And then Nina, that served us lunch, she just looked at us and she said, you cannot go back to Tbilisi in that state. Come on, sit by the fireside and you have to dry up. And then as we sat down, she came with wine, and then there was more wine and even more wine. And then it turned out that Julia, she was also really a nightclub singer. So the atmosphere just got better and better. And it was very, very late at night as we got back in the car, driving back to Tbilisi. And then maybe after 1 hour, Julia stopped the driver by a supermarket that was open 24 hours, and she came back again happily with a bottle of chacha, which is kind of like Italian grappa. It's very strong. And then she finished this bottle all by herself. So by the time we reached Tbilisi, she was snoring loudly and impossible to wake her up.
Yeah.
So that's Georgia to you. And I mean, they're not all like Julia, but quite a few of them. They're like Italians on speed.
Yeah, I know. Ooh, I already have a headache. In comparison to grappa, which just very, very strong. So I think I think I want to make sure we kind of, I suppose, discuss the elephant in the room, which is Ukraine. And obviously there's the current awful war there. But what struck me when I was kind of preparing for our chat was when you embarked on this journey in 2017, war with Russia and Ukraine was not on my mind, probably not on most of Americans' minds by any stretch of the imaginations or people in the West. But less so for the people that you met on your journey in Ukraine. There's a very striking photo in the book's insert of you with a history professor who has been, of course, enlisted. War and armed conflict were very much a part of daily life for many Ukrainians then, as they are now. And then I remember there's one chapter you closed where someone had referred to Ukraine as Little Russia. How telling. I know you have a section you'd like to read from about Ukraine that I think will be especially illuminating.
Mm-hmm. So it's very short.
Yeah.
The military hospital in Kiev was like a labyrinth. Not a single bed was empty. Young men were rolled down the corridors in wheelchairs, others hobbled along on crutches with a stump where there should have been a leg. One of the men moving laboriously along the corridor, meter by meter, was 25-year-old Pima. His face was scarred, and his mouth and eyes had lost their original shape. The tunnel where he was hiding had been hit by a large bomb. I was one of the first to be mobilized, but I was happy to go, Pima said. This is Russia's war with us. Putin is like Hitler. How can one country just come and take over another country in the 21st century? So I chose to read this passage because I met Pima in Kiev in 2016, so already 6 years ago. But this interview, these quotes could have been uttered today. It's just a reminder that, like you said, the war we're seeing today, of course, now it's on a much, much larger scale. It's been a total invasion of the whole of Ukraine, but the war really started in 2014. So it has lasted for 8 years already.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, I think, I think the, history has been there for us to understand and to see if, only we take the time to listen. And I think, some of the other countries that you visited, Lithuania, Estonia, Poland, and Finland, were surprised perhaps, but not so surprised when this happened. Were there any particular visits or stories that stood out when you visited those other kind of European, border countries, that might, help illuminate us as to why they were saying, this is why we're so paranoid, especially Finland. I know people had touted Finland as perhaps a model for what might happen to Ukraine, which I think if you talk to some Finns, they might say that's actually not such a grand thing.
Mm-hmm. Well, I found that the fear was biggest in the Baltic states, so in Estonia, Lithuania, Latvia, and these are the countries that what kind of the independence movement from the Soviet Union started in the Baltics. These countries were freed from the Russian Empire in 1918 after the First World War, and they enjoyed about 20 years of freedom. And then after the Second World War, they became part of the Soviet Union, but not happily so. These countries had done everything to become European in the 1990s. And then I'm sure that they are very happy today that they are part of the EU and NATO. They became members in 2004. And that is, I mean, when I traveled there, I met young women who looked like models and were telling me that they had weapons in their apartments and that they had trained and were prepared to go to the forest and fight against the Russians if the Russians would come. So just imagine living with that mentality. And then, of course, after the invasion of Ukraine in 2014, the fear got bigger, but they had always been afraid of their neighbor. And had bad experiences. But I'm not so worried about the Baltic states because they are members of NATO. And we've heard that Putin has used NATO as an excuse to go to war with Ukraine, stating that Ukraine might also become a member, and now Russia is surrounded by NATO countries, which is not true at all. And that's just an excuse. What he really wants to do is to destroy Ukraine. So I think the countries that I'm most worried about are the countries that have no allies, the countries that are alone, and the countries that used to be part of the Russian Empire, because that is the countries that Russia wants to get back, and the countries that have moved in a democratic direction. So that would be Georgia, certainly Ukraine, and Moldova.
Yeah, Moldova, I know they've been threatened too. And I guess, I don't know if they don't really have a democratic tradition like Moldova, or obviously Ukraine. But Kazakhstan, another country that you visited, does have, obviously was also part of the Russian Empire, the Soviet Union. And they actually have the longest border of any of the states that you visited. So, I know that ethnically the state is mostly Kazakh, but there is kind of a Russian ethnic minority there. And when you met a man named Roma, he had some neighbors that were very keen on their Russian ethnicity and being reunited with Russia, and maybe talk about how that tension is currently playing out.
Yes, I think Kazakhstan is very interesting. As you mentioned, it has a very, very long border with Russia, and the border between Russia and Kazakhstan, it's the second longest border between two countries in the world, only beaten by the US-Canadian border. And Kazakhstan is a big country. It's the 9th biggest country in the world, but it has a very small population, only about 19 million people. So you can imagine that Kazakhstan, even if it's a country rich in natural resources, it cannot militarily defend this border against Russia. And then, like many former Soviet states, Kazakhstan has a big ethnic Russian population. Now the percentage has changed a little bit. I mean, during the Soviet, in the 1950s, if I remember correctly, the Russians were in majority, and now they are about 20%, but still, it's a lot. And these Russians, like Roma that I met in the mountains close to the Russian border, they tend to live close to the Russian border. And then no one in Kazakhstan will admit that they are worried about what might happen in Kazakhstan. And they thread very carefully. They try to assert their independence, but at the same time, they are very careful not to provoke Russia or the Kremlin. And I believe it was this year that Putin said that, well, Kazakhstan is not really a country, which is also what he said about Ukraine. So that could make you worry. And what they have done, the Kazakh government, what they have done is that they have, with economic incentives, they have made ethnic Kazakhs move to the Russian-dominated areas in the north, so that these areas should not be too dominated by Russians. So that says something, that they are worried, but they are not willing to talk about it.
Yeah, that makes sense. And I'm sure current events have done nothing to change that.
Sorry, interestingly, in January, because before Ukraine became the top headline topic, it was Kazakhstan actually, and there were large protests in Kazakhstan in January, first over very high fuel prices, but very soon those protests started to be about democracy, that people wanted democracy. They wanted to be able to choose their own leaders, because Kazakhstan is not a democracy and never has been. And then what the new president in Kazakhstan did, surprisingly, was that he asked CSTO, so the Security Alliance, to intervene. So basically what he asked Moscow to come and help them. And even if at that time Russia was busy gathering their forces at the borders with Ukraine, still the day after, more than 2,000 Russian soldiers entered Kazakh territory, and then very soon after that, the protests were dead. I mean, the protesters could not really resist armed Russian soldiers.
Yeah.
So,
Wow.
I'm sure that in Moscow, the mood was very good when this call for help from Kazakhstan came. And then Russia had to go to Kazakhstan, their neighbor, and
help.
Make it help. Yeah.
Yes. 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 A particular brand of help, right? I guess kind of before we open it up to questions, one of Russia's neighbors, which is one of the few I think that actually has any parity, is China. And obviously China has a special relationship with Russia these days. It's only heightened by the war in Ukraine, but I think the Sino-Russian relationship is a little perhaps one-sided almost. But what did you kind of find, and what did you discover when you were on that kind of Sino-Russian border?
So today, China is the only of Russia's neighbors that are more powerful economically than Russia is. And it hasn't always been like that, but now it is. And today, it's Beijing has the key both to North Korea and to Russia. So last year, China was the most important economic partner for Russia, but this is not. This is not an equal relationship. So to China, the US is far more important economically than Russia is, and also China. We tend to want to believe that the world is united against Russia and for Ukraine, but that's not really the case. The two most populous countries in the world will not take a stand, and that's India and that is China. And to China, what I believe is that this war, of course, has a lot of bad consequences for China, but also a weak Russia is in China's interest, obviously.
Yeah, absolutely. I think now we can, open it up for questions from the panelists if people want to put it in the chat. There's so much to unpack here. Obviously, as you can see, Erika is intensely knowledgeable. So yeah, feel free to fire away. And I guess while people kind of come up with questions and put them in the chat, one thing that is kind of unrelated to what we've touched on thus far, was obviously there's so much history in the border. You mentioned there's talk about the old believers, which I personally find fascinating. And then there's also a lot of indigenous history that kind of pops up, throughout the narrative. There's the Yupiks in Siberia that are related to the Inuits, of course, the Tuvans, like Aragalan, and then also the Skolt Sami. They have a fascinating relationship with Russia. Maybe while people get their questions together, we can chat a bit about that.
Yes, and that is also what we tend to forget when we talk about Russia, is that Russia is so much more than Russians. There are more than 100 different ethnic groups living in Russia, and some of them are nomads, some of them still live quite traditionally. And I also got to meet some of these people, because many of them live in the most remote parts of Russia. And I got to meet some of them when I traveled through the Northeast Passage, which was maybe also the most memorable part of the journey around Russia, and the most difficult to make happen. because I mean, Russia's border is about 60,000 kilometers long, and 2/3 of that border, that is coastal border, maritime border. So it was for me very important to also include this coastal aspect, maritime aspect of Russia. So I tried for such a long time to find a boat that could take me through the Northeast Passage, and now the ice is melting, and the global warming is happening twice as fast in the Arctic as in the rest of the world. So very soon, this northern sea route could be kind of a shortcut from Asia to Europe. But at the moment, there is not much traffic, and I didn't find any boats going there until luckily I found it was a New Zealand adventure company. They were going through there for the first time, and I was lucky and got a bed in a cabin on that boat. And so we traveled through a landscape that very few people have seen, because the Arctic was one of the last places on Earth that was explored by men. And yeah, I could say man, but men is actually more correct, yeah. And also, since the ice is melting, it was also a very nostalgic journey, because we were traveling through a landscape that will soon cease to exist. And that to Russia is actually good news, because under the ice that is now melting, researchers believe that about 1/5 of the oil and gas resources of the world are laying there in the Arctic. So I believe that in the future, Arctic will be the battlefield, and Russia has already claimed 1.2 million square kilometers of Arctic territory, and that is twice the size of Ukraine. And some years ago, they planted the Russian flag on the North Pole, I mean, on the actual point underwater. And I don't believe that that was a symbolic action from the Russian side.
Yeah, no, I know that, yeah, the kind of close of that section, you know, we see that the kind of military presence is making itself more felt than ever before. So we're obviously, yeah, they once have been very unpopulated and desolate. So we have some questions coming in for the chat. One from Dr. Steve Capo, and he asks, who is protecting the rights of Ukrainians who have been forcibly relocated to Russia? Can they return to Ukraine?
Oh, that is a very timely question, and I'm afraid I cannot answer that question, because there is still so little information about what happens to the Ukrainians who are forcibly deported to Russia. Very little information is coming out. We know that the last estimate I read was that about 200,000 children have been forcibly deported to Russia. Many of these children are children who have lost their parents during the war. And the relatives often in Ukraine don't know where these children are taken. So I believe it can be very difficult to relocate these children in the future. And of course, it also depends on the regime in Russia. Under the current regime, there is no will to cooperate. So this is unfolding at the moment, and we don't know the end of it, and it's very difficult to see what the consequences will be in the long run.
Yeah, I know. Yeah, I guess, yeah, maybe as part of a peace negotiation would be to allow these people to repatriate, but that seems a long way off, certainly just based on what I read in the news today. So yeah, it'll be something for us all to think about, certainly.
But it does, I mean, when you look at the Soviet history, it is very scary to read about these deportations that's happening now, because that is something I believed certainly belonged to the dark past of the Soviet Union, the 30s, the 40s, the Stalin regime. And now we see it happening again in 2022 under Putin. And that is just terrifying.
Yeah, I know. Yeah, even the people who had protested in Russia, who had the kind of courage to do that, they protest against the war, and they're arrested and taken away. And yeah, I was reading it. I was like, where? To Lubyanka? Like, this is like reading it out of a Solzhenitsyn novel, but you know, it's not. It's, you know, right from the New York Times. So yeah, it is very scary indeed. So we have another question. Kristen asks, you know, says this is a fascinating project, which it is. What do you plan to write about next?
Okay, so I have, since the border, I have already written one book that was published in Norwegian in 2020, and that I believe will be published in the US next year. And that's High, a journey through the Himalayas. Because I had then been working with Russia and the former Soviet Union for more than 10 years, 15 years almost, and I decided, well, it's time to do something different. And then I asked myself, well, what could be possibly more intriguing, more fascinating than the former Soviet Union? And then the answer just came by itself, and that would have to be the tallest mountain range on Earth. And obviously for two reasons at least. The ethnic variation, which we already talked about, related to the border. So the Himalayas is one of the most ethnic, diverse regions in the world, obviously because of geography. So up through history, different people, different ethnic groups, they have found refuge in the mountains. So, I mean, if I look at my passport stamps, while doing research for this book, I traveled in 5 countries: China, Pakistan, India, Bhutan, and Nepal. But really, whenever I came to a new valley, it was like entering a new country. So I traveled through hundreds of countries, really, doing research for this book. And then I'm obviously very fascinated with borders. And then you can see the Himalayas as a physical border, a natural border between the 2 most populous countries on Earth.
Yeah, so for everyone attending, so Pegasus is excited to publish High, and we will publish that in January 3rd, 2023. So yes, I think there'll be some similarities, but also very different. And I can't wait to, you know, finish reading it and get it, you know, start to get it into readers' hands.
And then, well, the book that I'm working on now, that's also something completely different. For a long time, I was actually considering writing a book about Russia, but then because of COVID, the border between Russia and Norway was closed until November last year. And then, so then I decided to do another project. And now, given the current situation, I'm very happy about that, because I don't think it would have been safe to travel around as a foreigner asking questions in Russia at the moment. So now I'm writing a book, working on a book about the Portuguese Empire. So traveling through all the former colonies and territories of Portugal. And it's something to me completely new. It's extremely interesting. The Portuguese Empire was the first global overseas empire. Everything started with the Portuguese. They were the first to travel down, first Europeans to travel down the African coast. So the world that we live in today, the globalized world that we live in today, started with the Portuguese. The transatlantic slave trade started with the Portuguese. The Portuguese were in this tiny country in Europe. They were the first to establish trade with Japan, and also it was the longest living empire. Most of the African colonies got independent just in 1975. So still there is a lot of people who can remember the Portuguese and was like to live under Portuguese rule. So that's my current project.
Yeah, I think that'll be fascinating. Yeah, we're publishing a book about shipwrecks of slave ships, and a lot of those ships were Portuguese, of course, because of the role that Portugal played in the transatlantic slave trade. And interestingly enough, of the 2 countries that have never apologized for slavery and, you know, everything that, you know, went with it are the Portuguese and the Spanish. You know, so I think there will be a lot of things to unpack, you know, as you continue to work and write. So Well, this has just been marvelous. Thank you so much, everyone, for attending. Thank you to Kyle for hosting us. Any other questions, type them in now. But otherwise, I might turn it back over to Kyle.
Well, thank you so much. Thank you, Jessica, for moderating, and thank you so much, Erika, for the wonderful discussion. We would love to be able to present Hill as well, when it is released in January. So we hope you can come back for that. We do have other things going on at Scandinavia House. We have a few more book talks, virtual book talks. We have one on Halder Laxness and Ida Jensen in June and July. And we also are hosting our Nordic Summer Jazz Concert this month. So please do come visit the website, scandinavius.org. And thank you again for attending, and thank you again for participating. Goodbye.
Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.
Okay.